I think there's this thing of good or bad, like, we don't want to be in fight or flight, but yet that is the portal to excitement, to joy, to passion, to purpose and strength and motivation. And, I love getting into that state and being like, right, let's make stuff happen. And, this has been hard because years ago I would have been like, I should be more calm. But I'm like, I'm a very excitable person. Like when I'm passionate about something, it's like, let's go.
This is Crappy to Happy, and I am your host, Cass Dunn. I'm a clinical and coaching psychologist, a mindfulness meditation teacher, and of course, author of the Crappy to Happy books. In this show, I bring you conversations with interesting, inspiring, intelligent people who are experts in their field and who have something of value to share that will help you feel less crappy and more happy. Today's guest is Jessica Maguire, who is a physiotherapist and neurophysiology expert who wants to help you understand the root cause of many of our health issues, and that is our dysregulated nervous system. So after realizing the profoundly important role that the nervous system plays in our overall health and well-being, impacting things like anxiety, gut issues, relationships, even chronic fatigue, Jessica turned her attention to learning how to engage the vagus nerve to reset our nervous system and achieve optimal health and well-being. She's the founder of the Nervous System School. She's the author of The Nervous System Reset. Here is that conversation with Jessica. Jessica, such a pleasure to have you on the Crappy to Happy podcast.
Thank you, Cass, for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you.
Jessica, when I saw that you had written a book called The Nervous System Reset, I could not have been more excited because I am obsessed with the topic of the nervous system, as many people are. And I was really intrigued because I come from, I'm a psychologist and I come from a background of helping people with emotional regulation and anxiety and things like that. And I was so interested that you're a physiotherapist and that you have really come to the importance of the nervous system, but much more from that kind of physical health perspective, obviously, as well as emotional, psychological, I'm sure. So, Jessica, how did you come upon this idea in working with patients that actually what you needed to be doing is working with the nervous system?
Oh, it's such a good question, Cass. But I'd been working in clinic for about 10 years, and I would often see the patients who might have not done so well with acute treatment, like say they'd hurt their back and had been sort of 3 months on and they tried different things and it wasn't working, but they were, at that stage where they were getting pretty emotionally distressed as well as experiencing that physical pain. And so I could see certain associations that when they were coming in with physical pain, there'd also be things like emotional distress, insomnia, gut issues. And it just, a lot of the time, the patients would have had like a history of something going on in their lives, like maybe they'd had ups and downs with their flare-ups or other symptoms. And I just knew there was more going on beneath the surface. And, we have learned as physios when we look at pain that we can have changes, from what we think is just happening in the back, changes in the brain and the way that the spinal cord is sending messages. And I got really curious about that from an emotional point of view. And so I decided in 2017 that I was going to close my clinic up. And it was at that point that very sadly my brother passed away as well. So my own experience was going into nervous system dysregulation as well. And it was a coincidence, but I guess it's what really led to me walking the talk to take on these teachings, in a really embodied way. So I did a lot of research in interoception, which is the body's the sensory system of how we notice and understand our bodily signals. And it really pointed to the vagus nerve as being the main communicator. And so that led to all this work with the nervous system. And it's now my thing.
It is your thing. It is your thing. And I'm a bit torn here because I feel like saying, everybody's talking about the vagus nerve and everybody's talking about vagal tone, and you can go to TikTok and 5 tips to, improve your vagal tone. Like it seems to be all out there, but I'm also very conscious of the fact that there's probably people listening who maybe have not ever heard that expression. So
Mm.
maybe it would be helpful just to start with, and I don't know if you could do this like in a really brief way, just a really basic overview of what we're talking about when we talk about things like nervous system dysregulation and this idea of the vagus nerve and the role that it plays.
Yes, I'll do my best to keep it concise. I'm a massive
I
nerd,
know it's not a simple question.
it's a complex topic, but I think we could also make it as easy to understand as possible. But
Yes.
the vagus nerve acts as a bit of a bridge between the brain and the body. And so it's one of our cranial nerves. And cranial nerves are those nerves that are speaking from the body to the brain. But if you were to run your hand down the back of your skull, and you'd feel there's a bony ridge there, and you went inwards from there, that's where our brain stem is. So it's like the bottom stalk of the brain. And then if we had one hand on the heart, we have a branch of the vagus nerve that runs between the brain stem and the heart that acts to slow our physiology down. It helps us recover from stress. So it brings that slowing of our physiology and emotions. But then if that hand that's on your heart moved down to your lower belly, that would be another part of the vagus nerve. So it goes down into the gut and it touches almost every organ in kind from the brain. And so when we say, stress makes IBS worse or gut issues worse, this is how it plays out a lot of the time. But rather than thinking of it as one nerve that we can hack, a little bit like TikTok might explain,
Yes.
it's more a series of connections. So it's a little bit like an ecosystem where we've got the branch to the heart, to many of the organs, and there's even branches that go from the heart up to the face that are involved with our communication and how we interact with other people. And so when we look at that, it's got really 3 facets to it. It regulates our emotions, balances our physical health, and it also has a relational role too. But the interesting part is when we used to look at what's known as our nervous system, we once used to say it was just like the sympathetic branch, which is like the accelerator in a car, and then the parasympathetic branch, which is like the brake, and that slows us down. We could look at that also, those 2 branches as fight or flight, rest and digest. But we now know that that's actually not complete, the picture, and that we have 2 brakes, like we have 2 brakes in the car. So one is slowing us down via, if we think, the pedal with our foot. So that's the vagus nerve, the branch that runs from our brainstem to our heart, and it controls how we respond to things with accuracy. And the other branch is a little bit like pulling on the handbrake. And so we now know in the face of stress that some people shut down, they freeze, they collapse, and that makes a lot of sense, particularly when we look at things like how people respond in the face of adversity or trauma, where they can't speak, they can't take action. And dysregulation is where we get stuck, where it's a little bit like the accelerators press right down. We're always on, we can't relax, we feel anxious, we have insomnia, we have gut issues, or it can be a little bit like the handbrake is stuck on and we can't get motivated, we can't take action, we have burnout, apathy, depression. Is that concise enough?
That is perfect. That is perfect. You are well practiced at that, I can tell.
I do my best.
And I love, and for people listening, your book is out now. Congratulations. And there is a lot, you've gone into a lot of detail in there about the science of the nervous system and the brain. So for the science nerds, it's all there. But for the purposes of this podcast, I just wanted to have that brief summary. And I love also that you've used the terms in the book, and I've heard other people use this as well, too hot, too cold, and just right. It's like this Goldilocks kind of analogy, right? To help people to
Yes.
understand in simple terms what might be happening in their nervous system so that they can then have some ideas about what they need to do in response to that.
Yeah, exactly. It's a little bit like a shower. We have too much of the hot water, sympathetic, too much of the cold is that that handbrake. But where regulation is the warm water. It's a temperature that's just right, where we have a blend of both.
You mentioned, Jessica, about gut issues. And this is really interesting. Like, you're right. I think that sometimes we understand that stress can cause gut problems, but this overlay of our nervous system functioning and almost every aspect of our physical health, I think is a connection that many people don't make. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. And until probably people see the vagus nerve and that literal connection,
Yes.
it's probably a bit too abstract to picture the immune system or the hormonal system communicating seems a little bit strange. But I think for a lot of people, that light bulb moment is seeing the vagus nerve when we are stressed, how it's connecting to the gut and changing in response to what happens to us as well. So I think it explains a lot for people because the motility or the movement of food through the digestive system changes. We can see that that can lead to changes in things like the pH or the secretions, and all of that is like changing the soil for our gut microbes. And that's really
Mm.
what can be what leads to a lot of changes. So I think we've come from a really brain centric time, but we're looking at now seeing things like inflammation can be a portal to depression. So it's now starting to, go the big picture. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. It's a positive move that we're more understanding the role that the body plays. Um, the other thing that I wanted to say too, one thing that I find really interesting, I think is not well understood, I just want to throw this in there, is, and I know that you talk about this in the book as well, is that we think about sympathetic, like fight or flight, like you said, we're in that kind of activated, aroused state. And we think of parasympathetic as, like you said, it can either be like, oh yeah, chill out, rest, digest, or it can be that really shut down, no energy, no motivation.
Yes.
But there's also when there's a little bit of sympathetic, but it's safe, like that's more of a play state, right? So that's the difference between anxiety and excitement. Like that's like,
Yes.
yeah. And then there's when you are, so I guess when you're still and relaxed, but it's safe, there's rest, digest. But when there's that stillness, but it's more of a threat response or a shutdown response, then that's the too cold.
Exactly. It's really interesting, isn't it? Like, I think there's a little bit of like this thing of good or bad. Like, we
Yeah.
don't want to be in fight or flight, but yet that is the portal to excitement, to joy, to passion, to purpose and strength and motivation. And, I love getting into that state and being like, right, let's make stuff happen. And,
Yeah.
this has been hard because years ago I would have been like, I should be more calm, but I'm like, I'm a very excitable person. Like when I'm passionate about something, it's like, let's go. So I think for a lot of people, this is like with anger, right? If we say anger is a bad emotion, then the way we appraise that, we are actually having a change in our physiology where we might try and squash it. But it's really healthy for us to allow that anger in and to say, actually, no, this is not okay. I'm going to get a bit fired up here. So we need the heat, we need the heat for that mobilization to maybe have a hard conversation. Yes, play, but also sometimes we need to take the action as
You
well.
take
So,
action, yeah.
yeah, there's no good or bad parts to the nervous system. It's just with dysregulation, we often get stuck in those more threat response states for long periods of time.
So this is the key, right? It's if you are dysregulated and you're stuck in a nervous system state that is not the just right state, you're either stuck in the too hot or the too cold, then the key is, what do you do to be able to get back into that state? And I guess what I am picking up from this conversation, obviously, is this is a lot about people cultivating some self-awareness, about actually knowing what is happening in their own nervous system, because we are such cerebral beings. We're all up in our heads thinking about what we got to do. And we're even thinking about our feelings most of the time. I ask somebody, what are you feeling? And they say, well, I think they shouldn't have done that. And I go, no, that's a thought. That's not a feeling. Like people are so
Oh,
disconnected, right, from what they're
yeah.
actually experiencing. So where do you start with somebody, Jessica? And I can tell you, I've had clients, I've said, What are you feeling in your body? No clue. Zero.
Yeah.
No idea.
It's so common, Cass, isn't it? Like, and I think it's what you just said is so true. Like, we might have our feelings, but then there can be another layer of I should or shouldn't feel this, which is like
Mm.
such a complex thing that we put on top of it. And I think this is where like nervous system work is so powerful because, yes, first of all, it's the awareness to recognize the state that we're in. And also, it gives us just this little bit of space because when we're in anxiety, a lot of the time we're identifying as the anxiety itself. It's like, you know, we're caught up in this hurry, go faster, do this, do that. But then when we go, oh, wow, my nervous system's doing this, we've got enough space to look and to pause and go, oh, there's the thoughts that go with this state of go faster, do more, or something bad's going to happen. And, you know, in that too cold state, that's where we really see a lot of those stories like the hopelessness, the it's never going to get better, I will never fix this. So awareness is the start. And I guess this is where I probably get on my soapbox a little bit about the TikTok trends because if we if we actually want to change out of a state, the resources or the regulation tools that we use will often be different depending on what state we're in. So for example, lots of people talk about using, you know, like a breath in and then a long exhalation. And I've seen that so much when it says, if you've had trauma, just do this. And the thing is, like, if you were already in a state of shutdown, your heart is likely already going to be beating slow, you're feeling down, you're feeling flat. What you actually need is something that's going to upregulate you out of that. And, you know, if we all reach for the same tools, it's not working. So, the biggest part is to even before you reach for the tools, you've got to know these states in an embodied way, which means it's not being cognitive. It's like in your body, you can recognize the urgency or the shame spiral, like being able to tell that, which it takes so much practice. It's like learning a new language.
Yeah, it really is. And yeah, for many people, that is really, it's foreign to them. I'm thinking now, when I first trained as a psychologist, one of the first extra trainings I did was trained in mindfulness based cognitive therapy because I was really into mindfulness and meditation. And the very first thing that we teach in MBCT is the body scan. And it's,
Mm.
lie down on the floor and just systematically move your awareness through all the different parts of your body and just be curious about what sensations are there. Like,
Mm.
what are you feeling in your feet? How do you feel in your left big toe? Like what sensations are there? And for me, it was just, oh, well, this is just a mindfulness exercise. It's about bringing your awareness to a something. And in one of the first courses that I taught, somebody sat in that course, and at the end of that body scan, he told me he felt nothing. And
Oh,
that was my first experience. And that was somebody who had experienced a lot of trauma. And it was a course for people who had experienced chronic depression. But that was the very first time I'd ever experienced somebody saying, I got nothing. I'm feeling nothing.
yes.
And I know that that's not the average person, but I do think it's important to kind of
Mm.
normalize that for some people because it does really take practice if you've been really disconnected from your body for a long time, right?
Yeah, we talk about this as like if you imagine you've got a volume switch on sensations. And so people who are depressed, it's like the volume is turned down and it's too quiet. And so this is actually being proven in science when we look at how signals are sent up to a region in the brain called the insula, which is how we process our bodily sensations. And it's shown that there's less activity in this region for people who are are really depressed. And that's actually hard because to make decisions, like fast decisions, a lot of the time it's like a hell yes, hell no, and that's coming from the body,
Mm.
that feeling of like, yes, I want to do that, I know this is for me. And so, that means having to slowly think everything through, pros and cons. And they did a really interesting study for people who work in finance and that, really high pressure stakes. And those that could make decisions based on their bodily signals were more successful, like they made better
Yeah,
decisions.
wow.
So I think it's really interesting in that way. And then it was also showing that people who tended to be anxious, they were aware of the signals. It's like the volume was too loud, but there was a connection between the insular and fear circuitry. So immediately they appraise the sensation as a threat.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if you feel this warmth in your chest, it can turn into something bad's going to happen. So we can retrain that signal so we read those signals clearly and adjust the volume when we connect with our body so that we hear those signals accurately. But like you said, it takes practice. We've got like neuroplasticity, we're looking at like a 6 to 8 week window.
Yeah. Oh, that's good to know for people, and really helpful to know that that is something that can be practiced. If you have trouble feeling what you're feeling in your body or whatever, then it's okay. You can learn that. Good to know.
Exactly.
You used the analogy before about the brake of a car, and it reminded me that the vagal brake is another really important aspect of our nervous system, I guess, and part of that vagus nerve function in our body. And I was wondering if it might be useful to explain the role of the vagal brake and how we can kind of access it to regulate our own nervous system.
Yeah, I'd love to. It's so interesting from an evolutionary point of view with that branch of the vagus nerve. So the one that runs from the brainstem to the heart, it actually connects to the heart's pacemaker. And, we think that the heart might beat like a metronome like this, but it actually has changes. So when we breathe in, the heart beats faster, and then when we breathe out, it slows down. And that's actually the vagal brake. So to make this a little bit easier to understand, we'll swap from the car analogy to imagine you're riding a bike downhill and you would keep a little bit of the brake engaged with your fingers so you didn't go too fast. Well, that part of our vagus nerve actually does that to our heart all the time. So without the vagal brake, our heart would beat at rest around about 90 beats per minute. But because we've got that there, on average, it brings it down to, say, around 70 beats per minute, give or take, depending on your age and gender and fitness. So when we breathe in, there's a little bit of the brake coming off. When we breathe out, the brake comes back on. That gives us an indication. We can measure that through heart rate variability and see how that's actually working. But when we face stresses, what happens is, like say you're going to give a presentation or you've got to have a hard conversation, a little bit of that brake just relaxes, and that allows the mobilizing energy to come in from that too hot state. That's what brings focus, energy. It will actually elevate our blood pressure and our heart rate slightly, which we think, high blood pressure. But in this case, it's more just for mobilizing glucose as well to get to the brain so that we can sustain that attention. And then we face the challenge, and when that's over, the brake engages and we come back down. But the brake is affected by chronic and traumatic stress. So if we have like a stressful situation in our lives and then we don't get that period of recovery, it means that the brake actually stays off a little bit. And so the next time we face a challenge, we move into anxiety rather than just mobilizing this energy. But again, we can retrain the brake so that we match what's happening in our environment with the correct level of activation in our body too.
I find that so interesting, that idea of the vagal brake coming kind of on and off. And when I first learned about this, there was an exercise that I think I read, which was like, just notice, like as you breathe in and then as you breathe out, and just, again, it's one of these like tune into your body things, like notice, like there's just a little bit more activation on the in-breath and then a little bit more of relaxation on the out-breath, like quicker, slower. But that we can manage that too, that our breath is so automatic, but it's also something that we can have some control over and change our state.
Yeah, and it ties in with it when we consciously control it. But focus, like you were saying, is also linked to heart rate variability. So this way that we focus our attention can actually get the vagal brake working with more accuracy, which is amazing.
The term heart rate variability, so that describes, now let me see if I can say this. Heart rate variability is how quickly our heart rate comes back to, like, you explain it, you'll do it better than me.
I love it, Cass. So a lot of the time there's confusion around this because we think that it's our heart rate.
I just demonstrated that.
When we breathe in and we notice our heart beats faster, And then when we breathe out and it slows down, we can measure that beat to beat variation. And so when there's a high variation between the beats for our in breath and the beats for our out breath, like that difference is high, we know that the vagal brake is working well and our nervous system is more balanced. And, that's been linked to things like improved psychological health. It's been linked to improved physical health as well, emotional regulation. So there's definitely that correlate that we can scientifically say it's proving that our nervous system's working well and the benefits of that too.
So I have an Apple Watch, which mostly I never wear. But I just recently thought I need to wear that Apple Watch because I know it measures heart rate variability. I'm going to wear that and see what it says. And Jessica, I'm going to tell you, I could do a lot of meditation and mindfulness, and I feel like I'm a pretty chill, pretty easygoing person. Like I've worked on this, and my heart rate variability is really low. And I read that it's supposed to be high, like higher is better. And I was like, okay, that's it. Apple Watch is going back in the corner. I'm not wearing it anymore. But
Yes.
can we talk about that?
Yeah, look, it's interesting because the devices are more aimed at measuring resting heart rate rather than having really accurate data on heart rate variability. So, I'm not a huge fan of
I
them
cannot,
because
don't
of
have to worry
that.
about my
Yeah,
Apple
no,
Watch.
no. And also, like trying to measure through the wrist, it's not as accurate.
Okay.
The most accurate measurement is going to be at the chest, or the gold standard of course is ECGs.
Mm-hmm.
But we can also measure through like measuring at the chest, which is more accurate. But I think this is where I get a little bit another soapbox moment. External information can be really helpful, but also if it means that it disconnects us from what's actually happening in our body, do we then trust in our own body if we're listening to an external device which has been shown to have inaccuracy? So I think it's like using it with a grain of salt and really looking at, well, is this actually helpful or is it not?
Yeah. Very, very wise words there. Because I'm not going to lie, I thought, hang on, if low heart rate variability is associated with, potentially long-term chronic health issues, like I almost went into a little bit of a stress spiral myself. Like, I've got to fix this. I've got terrible heart rate variability.
Yeah, and it's a
Anyway,
bit different in science, a little bit different how that's measured for the research. So I'm sure you'd be great
yeah.
there, Cass.
I'm sure I'm good as gold. Anyway, enough about me. While I've got you here, you mentioned before neuroplasticity and bioplasticity. Tell me about bioplasticity.
Yeah. So this comes from one of my colleagues, Lorimer Molesley, who is an incredible researcher. But if we look at neuroplasticity first, now this has been out for a while and it's well proven that the brain and the nervous system can change. And so the word, if we take it, it tells us its meaning. So neuro refers to neurons, which are nerve cells, and plasticity means to change or to adapt. So we have this capacity through many things to change. I mean, our nervous system is always changing through what we experience. In essence, that's what trauma is. So our nervous system had an experience that was really big and it's adapted to make sure that it is ready to cope with that happening again. It's not helpful, a lot of those adaptations, but we can also, through neuroplasticity, adapt back. Now, we can look beyond neuroplasticity to explain what happens to our nervous system because we know that our immune system will change. We know that we spoke about the changes we can see in the digestive system when somebody isn't in the just right state very often. If they're spending a lot of time in the too hot or too cold, they might notice that they also have some pretty serious changes in the gut. We know that the vagus nerve regulates inflammation. And so if we are not coming back to that state where the vagus nerve is working well, then we can see changes that relate to pain. So the term bioplasticity is a better way for us to look at that because bio is referring to the whole person And, a lot of the time, I think that makes it really helpful for people when they can say, oh, that makes sense why this has happened and I have these symptoms, rather than sort of chasing symptoms. It's a bit like
Yeah.
we learn to see what's really underneath the water. If it was like an iceberg, like what we see at the top might be a gut issue. We might have insomnia, but underneath the surface could be the vagal brake isn't working well. We've become, like our nervous system has become oversensitive to cues of threat because of the experiences we've had. And a lot of the time, the experiences that shift us happen in relation to others. And so we may have difficulties in our relationships too that show up. And for a lot of people with attachment patterns where they
Mm.
get really anxious, when someone hasn't texted back, or they might find themselves withdrawing or isolating when things are hard. The networks to do with attachment are the same for regulation. So, as we work on our nervous system, our ability to connect with other people will also be healthier. And that's why I think we need to look just beyond neurons, because, there's a lot more that changes than simply nerves when we're looking at the nervous system.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that as well. And on a previous episode of the podcast, I had Anne Kelly. So she is a therapist from the States, and she hosts the Therapist Uncensored podcast. And she wrote a book, she and her partner wrote a book that really mapped attachment and these nervous system states across, like
Ah,
overlaid them about,
yeah.
and I just share this for anybody who's interested to listen to that episode. And she talked about, if you have a person who is more of that anxious attachment kind of pattern, then you probably default to that kind of too hot. And if you are more of an avoidant attachment, you
Yes.
probably default to more of the too cold. And like just seeing how these early experiences in our attachment relationships actually then impact, well, they impact our whole nervous system, obviously, but just that overlay with the window of tolerance, which you and I haven't talked about, but the window of tolerance and attachment. I just thought it was fascinating. So I'm glad that you mentioned that as well. So Jessica, when our nervous system is dysregulated, we're getting on with our life and we're busy and running around, or maybe we've shut down in that collapse state, it's all too much, then what can tend to happen when we're just operating on autopilot is, and I'm glad that you mentioned this as well, like we can go to strategies to artificially regulate our nervous system. I would love for you to talk some more about that.
Yeah, it's a good one, isn't it? And I mean, I'm putting my hand up here saying,
Oh,
"Hey,
all of us.
I'm
All of us.
I've reached for the chocolate."
We are all guilty. That's why it's relevant and important to mention, I think, because it's everybody.
Yes. And we're not, it's not, I think this is the tricky part, because it's not like we're looking to add another layer of shame or judgment here,
No.
but these are great clues to understand when we are using artificial regulators that it might be time to slow down and give ourselves some care. But basically, I would say the most common ones, when people are anxious, they might reach for their phone and start looking for all the information that they can get. I mean, take COVID, for instance. People were scrolling, looking at,
Yeah.
oh my goodness, there's this there, there's this is happening. And what's interesting with that is our thinking brain is, or the cognitive part of our brain is like, give me more information to give me safety. Like that's its strategy, is to get more information. But the survival part of our brain is still taking that in, and it's driving more and more dysregulation. But typically people might reach for their phone for researching or planning, that over planning. I'm going to find out everything, because it gives us a sense of feeling like we know what to expect. But we can see it where we might scroll on social media for hours and hours as a way
Mm.
to, we might do it to avoid, what's happening in our lives. If there's a lot of things we have to deal with that are hard, for some people, it could be a sense of looking for connection if they feel lonely or isolated as well. But I would say in our modern world that our phones are probably the most common one. But then we can use food as well. I mean, sugar
Yeah.
and that dopamine hit it does make us feel better for a moment. But and then alcohol is another big one for artificially regulating our nervous system, because if we don't have that capacity to bring ourselves back, we might try and contain what we're feeling in our body or numb it using things like alcohol or, other pharmaceuticals as well. So
Yeah.
it's one of those coping strategies, but there is a way, or lots of ways, that we can really look at, well, nobody's born to look for likes on Instagram. That's not what we're really looking for. But what is it underneath that's the need? Is it connection? Is it that we want more satisfaction with our job? Is it that we want to have more meaningful work? And I think we can use that to trace back to understanding a deeper need. But a lot of that is being able to connect into our body and see,
Yeah.
what is it that I really want? So they're clues, these artificial regulators, but unfortunately they do long term drive dysregulation more. Like alcohol will eventually make us feel more anxious.
Yeah.
The same with the food that we're eating, that's if we're using it in large amounts to bring regulation. So it's important for us to look at ways that we can truly support our nervous system. And I think that's why I love this work, because it helps us really tap into what we truly need.
Yeah, I thought it was so good that you mentioned that in the book because it can be a great pathway in for people. Like if people, typically people, like you said, like they might know that they're eating too much sugar or drinking too much wine or spending too much time on social media, and they go into this self-judgment and self-criticism and try to use willpower to
Yes.
break this bad habit, this very top down kind of shame myself and I should do something different and wonder why that's not working, then feel even worse about themselves and then just go back to the bad habit that makes them feel better about themselves. So it's a very vicious
Mhm.
cycle. Whereas if you use that as a way in to go, well, what actually is going on here? Like, what am I actually looking for in this moment? Like, what is the function that behavior is kind of serving for me? And be curious about it and actually use that to tune into your body. Perfect. Like, great way to understand what's actually happening in your nervous system and then use some of your tools that you suggest about how you can find a healthier way to get back into that optimal kind of state.
I totally agree.
So, Jessica, which leads me to the bit that everybody wants to know. So, what are some strategies? People can go out and buy the book, but what are some strategies that people can use, some healthy strategies for regulating your nervous system if you know that you're dysregulated?
Fantastic question, Cass. I think the biggest thing is for people who tend to go down into that too cold state, we know that a lot of shame maps there. And there is that withdrawal, that isolation, feeling alone. And this is where we may want to isolate, stonewall, pull away even more. That's what our physiology can tell us to do. So we can take ourselves to where people are. It doesn't mean that we have to, like, we probably over tell everyone to talk, but like if we're really struggling, it's it's probably too much of a reach for a lot of people to talk. So even just going to a park where we know there's lots of other people, or going to get a coffee from the barista, the librarian, being back in the community, so that like physiologically that will give our nervous system a feeling of belonging, which is the first step to coming out of feeling that alone. And that's sort of like some people describe the nervous system as a ladder with the dorsal, or that too cold state down the bottom. That's the hardest one to come out of. So we'll start there and say you got to bring yourself up, and it's mostly through connection. But we can upregulate too through things like gentle movement. I think this is where we say, okay, well, what would attune to where I'm at of how much we could do? Like a spin class is going to be too much. But for somebody to connect with their body, I love the sensory systems for this. So like proprioception is where we connect to the position of our joints. And that could be like, I'm going to push against a wall, and that's turning the signal back up on those sensations, because often we're going to be dissociated or cut off from our body. So it's like, I can make those sensations louder. And it seems so small, but once you get the brain and the body communicating together again, that is how we come back to that regulation. So that's really helpful. And proprioception can be great as well for coming out of the too hot state. Like the feeling of like a weighted, like we see weighted blankets, but whilst we have so much emphasis on ice baths, warmth is so regulating, like I feel like warmth missed out here. So even putting something on us that's really warm and has pressure, we're tapping into temperature regulation, which impacts on the nervous system, but also that proprioception as well. From there, as we start to come back closer and closer to regulation, this is really where we can tune into the inside of our body and start to connect with sensations. Like, what is it? Sometimes people struggle to name the emotion. I think that's a challenge, like what we've said. But if we can say, well, people might say, oh, I feel stressed. Well, what does it feel like to feel stressed? How do you know that you're stressed? Is it that your heart is going a little bit faster, or the tension in your jaw, or is there like a gritty feeling in your face where it's like, oh, I just don't feel, So as we connect with that, we are engaging that part of the brain that I mentioned before, the insula, which has a regulating effect and brings the vagus nerve back into play, the vagal brake. And I'm a big one for what sensory systems can we connect with in the present, in a way that like connects us to our environment and our body, because dysregulation is essentially we lose a connection with ourselves, with our environment, and with other people. And that even more perpetuates that cycle of I don't belong, I'm not safe, the world's not safe. So once we can connect back, then we can get enough groundedness to begin to find our way home again to feeling safe in our body.
That's a really great, what you just said then about connecting to ourselves, other people, and the environment. Like that sums it up. That if people just hold that in mind, how do I feel more connected to myself, to other people, and the environment, whatever state I'm in, then that's the key, whatever's going to work to get you there.
Exactly. It's really like, this autonomic nervous system is like this filter or this way that we are interacting with the world and our body. And so being able to come back to connection. And I think if we said, well, what is well-being? It is connection. That is in essence what it is. So trauma would take us to disconnection, to that fragmenting, and learning to come back to feeling connected is what promotes wellness in all areas of our brain and body.
You've listed in the book 4 kind of key tools, which we won't go into detail with now, but can I just run through them? The 4?
Of course.
Breathing. So perfect. Breathing. We hear a lot about breathing these days. Posture, containment, and co-regulation. Co-regulation you mentioned already. Can you just talk about containment for a second?
We might think of this as like we experience an emotion, and this is how we have the capacity to process it. So you could almost think of this like 3 measuring cups, right? So say you've got like the quarter measuring cup, and it's quite small. And then you've got a half, and then you've got the full cup. And you might have a jug full of water. And you think about, well, if my container is the quarter of a cup and I pour it in, it's soon going to spill out and spill over. And I see that when we label emotions as bad, or when we try and get rid of them straight away, or we think we need to have like this release from them, or maybe sometimes even when we go for a TikTok resource straight away before we've had a chance to actually attune to what's happening. I'm going to say our capacity to hold that experience is quite small. But let's say I have some awareness of my nervous system. I can connect to my body. I can connect to my environment. My capacity is going to be like the cup. And so I can hold more water, and it may not be that it's perfect. I may feel a little bit overwhelmed. I may get a bit anxious, but it's not going to be that flooding. It's not going to be that complete overwhelm where I can't think clearly. And so we can use our body and the way we're connecting to it to create a bigger container, because those emotions aren't bad, that like anger. They've got a really important message in them, but it's that our capacity to relate to anger is often, particularly for women, it's something that this whole thing about being nice is it's hard for us to allow anger in and then to express it. And so for a lot of women, what I've seen happen is anger comes in, there's a suppression, and it leads to this like collapse, rather than saying, I'm angry. Like I need to, and we don't even need to express it straight away. It's that before that, it's being able to contain it. And so our capacity stretches when we can build a bigger container by being able to connect to our body, to stay grounded as big emotions come through, and to attune to them as we would to a distressed friend. That's the essence of self-regulation. And I think there's probably a little bit of confusion sometimes where we think regulation is that we're at this calm flat line all the time, and that's not really what regulation's about. We're going to have these ups and downs, but it's how we proactively manage our emotional states. And sometimes that is just being able to go, I need to allow this process to come through. And I think for a lot of people, that's the step that is missed, and they continue to feel unhappy.
And then create all sorts of damage to their bodies, obviously, because of the vagus nerve and the mind-body connection. Jessica, I just need to tell you have the most perfect analogies and ways of explaining things. Like it's pretty complex neuroscience, and you've just summed it up so beautifully. I really appreciate that you've been able to do that. Where can people find out more about you and what you do if this is something that fascinates them as much as it fascinates me?
Thank you so much, Cass, for your kind words. I appreciate that. So the easiest place to find out about what I share is jessicamaguire.com. That's my website. I do love being over on Instagram as well. So lots of resources there, and my handle there is Repairing the Nervous System, or you can just look up my name.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and congratulations on everything.
Thank you, Cass.
Jessica's book, The Nervous System Reset, is now available in all bookstores. As always, if you enjoy the show, please think about leaving us a 5-star rating and a review. Come and follow me on Instagram, @casdun_xo, or you can follow Crappy to Happy Pod. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend. It really does help us to get into the ears of more listeners and to continue to grow the show. Thank you so much for being here. And as always, I can't wait to catch you next week for another episode of Crappy to Happy.